Historical photos can be the best way for people today to realize the true horrors of terrible events from the past. It can be hard for words on a page to really portray just how awful a storm from 100 years ago or a massive evacuation could be. Other photographs seem ordinary, but the events that took place just moments later leave a creepy edge to the images. Number 10. The 1900 Galveston Hurricane was one of the most horrific natural disasters that the United States has ever seen. Photographs of the aftermath portray some of the devastation, but it was said at the time that the full story of the hurricane would never be known, as many of the voices were no longer alive. Between 8,000 and 12,000 people lost their lives during the storm, most of them in the city of Galveston. At the turn of the century, Galveston was a boom town. The city is located on an island just off the coast of Texas and the Gulf of Mexico. Galveston Island is a barrier island, a thin stretch of land just 3 miles wide at its widest point. In 1900, it also barely sat above sea level, with the highest point of less than 9 feet. What made the island and the city so popular, though, was its position in the bay. It had access to deep-sea ports, making it the best place for Texas's exports to travel through. The city was one of the richest per capita in the country, something that was reflected in ornate buildings and possibly a more complacent attitude. Galveston had withstood heavy storms and hurricanes before, including one only a few decades earlier. Other neighboring islands also have been destroyed in more recent storms, and some residents worried that their own homes could be next. But it wasn't too much of a concern. The island's only natural defenses, sand dunes that lined the beaches, were removed so the sand could be used elsewhere. As well as a lack of preparation, hurricane predictions weren't anywhere near as accurate at that point in history as they are today. One of the most advanced meteorological institutions at that time was located in Cuba. Keeping track of tropical storms and hurricanes was essential for the Caribbean country, but the predictions and information from Cuba wouldn't make it to the US. The officials in charge of the Weather Bureau in Washington had shut down communication lines with Cuba in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. So while Cuba predicted that the tropical storm would become a hurricane as it made its way northwest, those in Washington thought that the storm would continue northeast, through Florida and up the eastern coast of the United States. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The storm hit Galveston early on September 8th. At first, it didn't seem like much, but meteorologists on the island tried to warn people to get to higher ground and into sturdy buildings. As the day progressed, the winds became higher and higher. The weather station reported winds of 100 miles per hour before their equipment was destroyed. It estimated that winds reached about 120 miles per hour. Getting to the high ground was of little use when storm surges reached 16 feet tall. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. Thousands of people were caught with nowhere to go as the water rose higher and higher. Letters written by survivors talk of the screams of the victims being heard over the crashing of structures and the screaming of the wind. There was little that those who heard the screams could do to help. By the next morning, the hurricane had passed over Galveston, leaving behind bright and sunny weather. Work began to clear the devastation and deal with the remains of those who'd not survived. Many photographs were taken of the storm, even as those who went through it struggled to describe what happened to them. Number 9. In the early 1930s, residents of the Central Plains were used to dust storms. But even for those who'd been living with the dust for years, the events of April 14, 1935 felt like the end of the world. Black Sunday would inspire the term the Dust Bowl and remained ingrained in the memories of people for decades to come. The Dust Bowl phenomenon had two primary causes, one man-made and the other natural. During the 1910s, the high price of wheat had inspired people to move to the Central Plains to grow the crop. The prairie grass was pulled up so wheat could be planted. The farmers didn't realize that they were damaging the soil with farming practices, unsuitable for this semi-arid environment. The second cause was a decade-long drought that hit in the 1930s. Without the prairie grass to keep it together, the topsoil became loose. The drought made it dry, so whenever any significant wind blew, tons of topsoil would be pulled up and spread through the air like dust. For years, the people who had made their homes in states like Kansas and Oklahoma lived with the dust storms, though many left to try to make new homes in California. There were a series of bad storms in early April, but it looked like April 14th would be different. It was a bright, sunny day, and many people tried to make the most of the good weather. It meant more people than usual were out of the house that day. Reports came in of temperatures dropping, which usually signaled a storm was coming. Unfortunately, many people didn't follow the warnings until it was too late. A cold front from the north had moved in. When it hit warmer air, winds picked up and a storm began. Photographs from that day show great black clouds towering over the buildings. Many resemble something like a tsunami, but a wall of dust rather than rolling water over the plains. In some places, the storm had winds of 60 miles per hour. People tried to outdrive the cloud, but it would inevitably catch them. Reports described the dust as being so thick that people couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. Anybody caught out in their cars had to stop driving and either hope that their cars could keep the dust out or make their way home on foot. For many people, it seemed like the Black Sunday storm was the end of the world. There had been storms before, but this was the worst they had ever experienced. The storm inspired singer-songwriter Woody Guthrie to write the song "So Long It's Been Good to Know Ya," which captured how the people around him thought that this would be the end. The storm lasted for hours, spreading from central Nebraska south and into the Texas Panhandle. It carried twice as much dirt as was dug out during the creation of the Panama Canal, creating dunes against buildings and covering the landscape in a blanket many inches thick. Some of the dust even spread to the East Coast, causing a haze as far away as Washington. There, some people were already trying to argue that conservation efforts needed to be put in place to stop the dust storms from getting worse. The arrival of topsoil that had once rested hundreds of miles away helped to make their point. Two people caught in the Black Sunday storm were Robert Geiger and Harry Eisenhard, a reporter and photographer for the Associated Press. The following day, Robert wrote about his experience, using the phrase, quote, "the Dust Bowl of the continent" for the first time. The name would stick, and it's what we remember this era of history as today. Number 8. On May 5, 1920, Vladimir Lenin spoke to the Red Army in Sverdlov Square, Moscow. A famous photograph of the speech was captured and shared across the Soviet Union, but the exact photo that would have been seen depended on what time period it was shared. Historical photographs are often used to provide insight into what the period was actually like. It's easy enough for the recollections of people who were there to be manipulated or completely falsified. But for the most part, if a photo can be accurately dated to the period, it's usually itself an accurate representation of that time. But that isn't always the case. Photo manipulation is almost as old as photography itself. But things were taken to a new level when Joseph Stalin was in control of the Soviet Union. Originally, photographs were touched up for aesthetic purposes, to make Stalin look more powerful and to remove blemishes. But of course, not all of these edits were so innocent. During the Great Purge, thousands of people lost their lives and were sent to labor camps. Many of these had previously been high-ranking officials within the Communist Party who'd fallen from grace, or people within Stalin's inner circle. Historical photographs were added to remove the disgraced individual from the historical record. In this way, Stalin was able to effectively change the history that people within the Soviet Union were learning. It could make him seem like a more effective and loved leader if there had never been any opposition to his leadership, and if he never made any bad judgment calls. It also enabled him to portray himself as the closest person to Lenin. Sometimes a single photograph would have to be edited multiple times, as different individuals in the picture fell from grace at different times. Possibly the most famous victim of Stalin's censorship was Leon Trotsky. Many people in the party supported Trotsky over Stalin as Lenin's successor. But the internal struggle ended with Stalin's victory, and Trotsky being exiled and later having his life taken. Because Trotsky had been such an important figure in the party up until that point, he appeared in many photographs, including the famous one of Lenin giving his speech at Sverdlov Square. Also in the photograph was Lev Kamenev, an important figure in the early Soviet government. He had also opposed Stalin. The two revolutionaries stood on the steps of the platform that Lenin spoke from. Any photographs of Lenin's speech would show Trotsky and Kamenev, unless the photo was cropped to remove the crowd as well. This would lessen the effect of the image, but Stalin wanted to continue to share these famous photographs. Instead, the two men were cut out of the photos, making it seem like the stairs were empty. By itself, the photo isn't too creepy, but it's scary to imagine what else could have been eliminated from the historical record. Thankfully, after the fall of the Soviet Union, more information about this practice has been shared. This means that we have a good idea today of the censorship that took place, and can now look at images of people who are supposed to not exist. Number 7. On November 3, 1957, Sputnik 2 was launched into space, along with the first living animal to ever orbit the Earth. The animal was a small dog named Laika, who quickly reached international fame. But Laika's story was a sad and disturbing one, the extent of which the public didn't discover until decades later. Sputnik 1 was the first artificial satellite to be sent into orbit. It was launched in October of 1957 and orbited the Earth for months. It was a small object, only 23 inches in diameter, and weighed 184 pounds. It also didn't do too much while in space, other than send beeps back down to Earth. The next satellite would be both bigger and technologically advanced, and it would take the first animal into orbit. Animals, including dogs, had been sent on space missions before, but all had remained in low Earth orbit. This would be the furthest any living creature had been from the surface of the planet. This would be a great show of how advanced the Soviet Union was technologically, and another win in the space race against the US. But Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev wanted it to be a powerful statement, as powerful as possible. Shortly after the launch of Sputnik 1, Khrushchev announced that the launch of the next satellite would take place on November 3rd, less than a month later, and on the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution. Scientists rushed to get the new rocket prepared for launch, along with new devices that would measure things such as cosmic rays and solar irradiance. Meanwhile, others set about finding a passenger. Stray dogs from the streets of Moscow were selected. They had to be small but not too small, with a bright coat so they could be picked up on camera. They also had to be female. The dogs then went through a rigorous selection process, making sure they would not become too stressed by the noises, the confined space, and the forces involved in such a launch. The dog that would be known as Laika was eventually selected. She was given the name after barking during a radio interview, with the name translating to barker. Laika was kept in smaller and smaller cages to prepare her for the launch. Sputnik 2 was larger than its predecessor, but there still wouldn't be much space for Laika to move. Once in the satellite, she was kept in place with a chain so that she could only lay down or stand up. Her spacesuit included a sanitation device and sensors so that scientists on Earth could monitor her breathing. The launch went ahead as planned. The sensors revealed that Laika had been stressed during it, but calmed down once she became weightless. But there had been one problem with the launch. Some of the thermal insulation was damaged, and the cooling system inside the capsule didn't work as intended. Laika's first orbits around the Earth were successful. Soviet scientists believed that she would last around 7 days in orbit before she ran out of oxygen. They expected she would then pass away quickly. The media was told that she'd been sent up with poisoned food, which would be released at a certain time so that she wouldn't suffer. But this wasn't the case. After just a few orbits, the temperature inside the capsule became unbearable. In 2002, declassified data from the mission revealed that Laika had only lasted a few more hours. The mission was still heralded as a success, even though scientists didn't learn much from Laika being present. She would become a cultural icon in the Soviet Union and beyond, and even today features in children's books and other media. Number 6. On June 28, 1914, photographers gathered outside the city hall of Sarajevo to capture images of the heir to the Austria-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. One of these photos showed the royal couple walking down the steps to the car, being saluted by some of the officials who'd come to see them. Just minutes after the picture was taken, both would have their lives taken. June 28th was supposed to be the last day of a visit for the royal couple to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. Ferdinand had spent the past few days inspecting military drills, while his wife went to visit orphanages and schools. It all went according to schedule, and the royal couple thought that they had nothing to fear for the final day of their trip. There had been some warnings before the trip about hostility in Sarajevo if Ferdinand made the trip. There were many in Bosnia who opposed the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The country had only come under the control of the Habsburgs a few years earlier. It was a move that was greatly opposed by Serbia, who believed that Bosnia and Serbia should be united instead. Ferdinand was also opposed to the occupation of Bosnia, as he believed that this would only add to the political instability of the empire, but his uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, didn't see eye to eye with him on this and many other issues. But even with the warnings, no hostilities had been seen. Neither Ferdinand nor any of the staff around him seemed to believe he was in any danger. The plan for this final day of the trip included a motorcade to City Hall, with the route announced in advance and published in the newspapers. Crowds lined the streets to see the royal couple. Photographs from the day showed Ferdinand and Sophie smiling as they greeted dignitaries and enjoyed the positivity. But among the crowd were a couple of would-be assassins with links to the Black Hand organization. They wanted Austro-Hungary out of Bosnia and the unification of Serbia. June 28th was the anniversary of the First Battle of Kosovo, an important date for Bosnian nationalists. So having a parade for their heir to the Austrian throne on this date would have felt even more insulting. Two of the would-be assassins failed to go through with the plot. A third threw a device at the Archduke's car, but it bounced off and caused no damage to the royal couple. Soldiers in another car and some members of the public suffered minor wounds and were taken to the hospital. Despite the attack, the plans for the day went ahead. The Archduke was quickly taken to City Hall, where he met with officials and seemed to act like nothing had happened. As he left the building, though, and as the final photos of the royal couple were taken, he didn't start his journey home. Instead, he decided to go and visit the wounded people in the hospital. The motorcade started down the same avenue where the first attack had taken place, but the first three cars took a wrong turn on the way to the hospital. They stopped outside a cafe, where 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip was standing. Princip was part of the plot against Franz Ferdinand's life, and while this wasn't part of the plan, he decided to take his opportunity. As the chauffeur tried to reverse out of the street, Princip fired twice, striking Ferdinand and Sophie. Within minutes, they had both passed away, and Princip was quickly captured. The assassination was the spark that ignited tension that had been building between Europe, with Austro-Hungary declaring war on Serbia a month after Franz Ferdinand passed away. Soon after, Germany, Russia, France, Belgium, and the UK were involved in what would be called the Great War. Number 5. On the evening of May 6, 1937, news photographers and reporters gathered at an airfield in New Jersey. They didn't expect to capture anything particularly historic. An airship was making its first Atlantic crossing to the US of the year, but it wasn't even the first time this particular ship had arrived in the country. But the photographers were in a position to capture images of a dramatic 40 seconds that was the Hindenburg disaster. The Hindenburg was the largest airship of the time and offered the quickest way for civilians to travel across the Atlantic Ocean. She'd first started operations the previous year and made many round trips between Germany and the Americas. Not only was she quicker than ocean liners, but passengers could also travel in luxury and see the world from a view that most had never had the chance to before. The May 1937 trip was the first of 10 round trips between the US and Europe planned for that year. The plan was for passengers to arrive at Lakehurst Naval Station on the afternoon of May 6th, and then for representatives from American Airlines to take them to Newark Airport for connecting flights. Meanwhile, another group of passengers would board the Hindenburg for the return flight. Only 36 passengers were aboard when the Hindenburg left Frankfurt, Germany on the evening of May 3rd. It was half the capacity the airship could carry, but many more passengers had booked flights for the return journey, most traveling to attend the coronation of King George VI of Great Britain. Also aboard were 61 crewmen, including Captain Max Pruss. The flight over the Atlantic was uneventful though, and the weather meant that they'd lost time as they approached New York. Storms in the New Jersey area further delayed the landing. As they waited to land, the Hindenburg took a tour over Manhattan, attracting the attention of those below. Many photographs of the great airship were taken as it passed the New York skyline. Some newsreels were even captured from a plane, which was quickly sent up by Path News. Eventually, at about 7 p.m., the Hindenburg came in for a landing at Lakehurst Airfield. Due to the delays, civilians were not permitted at the mooring location, or to come aboard while the Hindenburg was docked. Even so, there was a spectator area where many had gathered to watch. As the airship arrived at the field, a light rain began. The wind changed direction, causing Captain Press to attempt an S-turn so that the ship would be facing the wind as it landed. What exactly caused the disaster is still something of a mystery today. It's possible that the sharp turns caused a line to break and tear into the hydrogen cells. Some witnesses reported seeing the cover of the ship fluttering as if gas was escaping towards the rear of the vessel. Then something caused a spark. This was likely just static electricity, though some have blamed the phenomenon of St. Elmo's fire. Whatever caused the spark, the hydrogen gas ignited quickly. The fire rapidly spread through the ship towards the front, which was higher than the rear. Cameramen on the ground quickly turned their lenses to the airship. The most famous photo of the Hindenburg was captured by photographer Sam Shear. He didn't even have time to put the camera to his eye before taking this historical photograph. Passengers and crew members jumped from the windows to try to escape. Even though the disaster took place over a matter of seconds, most on board managed to escape. But unfortunately, 36 people, including one on ground, did not survive. The Hindenburg disaster has been blamed for the end of the golden age of airships. While there were more factors that caused airships to fall out of favor, the dramatic end to this ship's life likely quickened its decline. Number 4. In 1925, a French military photographer named Marcelin Flandrin captured an enigmatic and disturbing image while on a flight across the Atlas Mountains. A lone lion walked across the sands, leaving behind a trail of paw prints. This was the last time the Barbary lion would be captured on camera in the wild. The Barbary lion was a distinct population of the northern lion subspecies. For 100,000 years it lived in North Africa, from Morocco to Egypt. The lion would become a favorite of ancient civilizations and a cultural icon, but human activity drove the lion locally extinct. The Barbary lion wasn't its own subspecies. It stood out compared to other members of the North lion family. The lion had adapted to living in the unique climate found in the Atlas Mountains, with cool winters and Mediterranean summers. They were generally larger, and the male lions had larger, dark-colored manes. Rather than living in prides like their more famous sub-Saharan cousins, the Barbary lion was isolated. There is some evidence that they lived in small family groups, but many may have survived alone, like the subject of Flandrin's famous photo. From 1900 onward, very few, if any, were seen in the wild. In 1922, a hunter took the life of a Barbary lion, which is believed to have been the last one successfully hunted in the wild. For many, it seemed like this was the end of the Barbary lion, but the isolation of the animals meant they lived on, for at least a few more decades. Flandrin's historic photograph is evidence that the Barbary lion lived on until at least 1925. More recent research has shown there were sightings as recently as 1958. This sighting took place in a forested area of Algeria. Unfortunately, that forest was destroyed during the French-Algerian War, and no more sightings were seen afterward. It's possible that the war was the final nail in the coffin for this subspecies in the wild. For a while, the Barbary lion lived on in captivity. Today, it's believed that the lions in zoos across Europe, Morocco, and Israel are mixed between Barbary lions and other northern lions. Number 3. In 1929, the Roaring Twenties came to an end dramatically with a stock market crash that would lead to a decade-long depression that spread around the world. Some of the early signs of the Great Depression were a series of bank runs that took place in the early 1930s, which were captured in a series of terrifying images of panic-stricken individuals. Bank runs can happen at any time, and often begin with little more than a rumor. Ordinary people hear that for whatever reason a bank is in trouble. If a bank collapses, it's possible that the people who have money stored in that bank will lose everything. To stop this from happening, people rush to withdraw all the money in their bank accounts. Doing this only increases the panic, which leads to more people trying to take out their money. If not controlled in time, the bank run will lead to the bank collapsing, and anybody who couldn't take out their money in time loses everything. The bank runs of the early 1930s started regionally. The stock market crash meant people had to rely on their previous sources of income. For farmers, that had been decreasing in recent years, and they had to instead take out their savings to support themselves. As more people took out their money, the panic started to spread. Banks tried to borrow money from others in the region, which only caused the banking panic to spread. The reason why people taking out their money is so dangerous for banks is simple. The banks only keep a fraction of the money that's deposited with them. The rest is loaned out or invested in projects. That keeps the money in circulation and can help support businesses and people buying homes. But it also means that when a large number of customers want to take all their money out at once, there isn't anything for the banks to give them. Sometimes assets are sold, but this is normally at rock-bottom prices. It also means that banks stop lending to businesses, which only causes more economic downturns. What started regionally spread to the entire country in a series of bank runs that lasted into 1933. Banks tried to keep customers calm. One attempt to stop the crisis was with banking holidays, where all the banks in a certain region would close so that they could try to get more capital. There was hope that doing this would allow the panic to dissipate, but instead it just helped to spread the panic even more. It wasn't until 1933, as President Franklin D. Roosevelt came into office, that the bank panics finally came to an end. A nationwide banking holiday was announced while the government came up with emergency legislation to stop something like this from happening again. The legislation worked, and the bank runs came to an end. In fact, when the banks opened again, people lined up to deposit their money back into banks, backed by the Federal Reserve. But the end of the banking crisis wouldn't stop the Great Depression from taking place. Many banks had closed during the crisis. Millions lost their life savings, and businesses had few places to turn for support. This was just the beginning of the depression that was to come. Number 2. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba captured a photograph that threw the entire world into chaos. What seemed to the untrained eye to be a photograph of a normal patch of woodland was the trigger of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States had been suspicious of the Soviet Union and Cuba for a while. Intelligence staff had noticed an increase in the number of Soviet ships heading to the Caribbean island. President John F. Kennedy had issued warnings to his Soviet counterpart about a communist buildup in Cuba, but they couldn't say for certain whether anything was actually happening on the island. Spy planes were sent on reconnaissance missions over Cuba and the Soviet vessels that were arriving. At first, nothing was picked up. Then bad weather hit the area on October 7th and lingered for about a week. It wasn't until Sunday, October 14th, that spy planes could get clear images of the area again. What they caught was shocking. Even though the intelligence agencies in the US were expecting something, the now historic photograph was still disturbing to them. The following day, analysts examined the photographs, making sure that it showed what they believed it did. And unfortunately, they were correct. It wasn't only a military buildup, but launch sites and missile trucks had been captured on camera. By looking at the sizes of the trucks and other clues, analysts were able to confirm that the missiles in question would have been able to hit most of the continental US, including Washington, D.C. During the next 2 weeks, the world came the closest it ever would to being destroyed. 2 days after the photograph was taken, the president was informed and plans were made about what to do. It wasn't yet known just how many nuclear weapons were in Cuba, and how many more would be arriving. Acting too rashly could have resulted in a strike taking place. In reality, the presence of weapons in Cuba didn't change the balance too much, as the Soviet Union already had access to nuclear weapons on submarines. But after so much condemnation of any kind of buildup, backing down would have been disastrous to the US. A blockade was put in place, and planes in the US went on standby, just in case nuclear war couldn't be avoided. In the United Nations, the US confronted the Soviet Union with photographs from the U-2 spy planes in the United Nations. The US ambassador challenged his Soviet counterpart to admit to the existence of the weapons, but the Soviet ambassador refused to answer. The fate of the world hung in the balance. Beneath the sea in the Caribbean, sailors on Soviet submarines, cut off from the rest of the world, debated whether the war had started. In the north, a US plane accidentally crossed into Soviet territory when its navigation equipment malfunctioned, and it had to be guided back to Alaska, while Soviet planes watched to see what the airspace violation meant. All the while, spy planes were taking more and more photographs of the buildup in Cuba. Eventually, on October 27th, an agreement was made between President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. The Soviets would remove their weapons from Cuba, and the US agreed to never invade Cuba. The president also secretly agreed to remove their own missiles from sites in Turkey and Italy. The world took a step away from disaster and has never come that close to a nuclear apocalypse since. Number 1. Photographs from the evacuation of Dunkirk show lines of thousands of men waiting to be rescued from a terrifying and dark fate. The operation is sometimes called the Miracle of Dunkirk and was a strange boost of morale for the British public after a terrifying moment at the start of World War II. After declaring war on Germany in September of 1939, the British Expeditionary Force was sent to France and Belgium to stop the invasions west. This was the majority of Britain's trained troops. For months, there was little movement on the Western Front. Then, in May of 1940, a small German force swept through the Low Countries. British, French, and Belgian forces went out to meet it. But this was only a diversion, with the main German army heading through Luxembourg and encircling the Allied forces. The Allied forces fought on, but day after day, the German army took ports and cities. The British, French, and Belgians were trapped in a smaller and smaller location. Soon, only the port city of Dunkirk was available to them. An evacuation was set into motion. The command center in Britain was based at Dover Castle, in a room dug into the chalk cliffs. The plan for the evacuation was named Operation Dynamo, but commanders knew it was unlikely they'd be able to rescue more than 30,000 men. Almost 250,000 were stranded at Dunkirk. Dunkirk was not a great place to launch a mass evacuation. The docks had been destroyed by German aircraft, and waters around the port were shallow. Even at high tide, the large British Navy destroyers couldn't get close enough to pick up any of the soldiers. There was one positive about Dunkirk, though. It had a long seawall, or mole, which stretched out into the deep water. Tens of thousands of soldiers crowded into the mole to await evacuation. There were few ways for the strategists in Britain to talk to the soldiers left in France, and in some places the beaches of Dunkirk were chaotic. One soldier was so afraid he was going to be separated from the rest of his troop that he took a railway map from a cafe so that he would be able to make his way back to the coast if the worst happened. Some people described it as a situation where every man was for himself, but photographs from the historic event show a much more orderly scene. Most of the evacuation took place over the mole, but thousands of soldiers were evacuated from the beaches themselves. One of the reasons the Dunkirk evacuation is remembered today is because of the so-called small boats that made the trip across the English Channel to be part of the operation. Many of these were civilian vessels. Everything from sailing barges to fishing boats to pleasure vessels were volunteered for the evacuation effort. Most were piloted by Royal Navy personnel, but some civilians even made the trip themselves. The small boats carried soldiers from the beaches to the larger vessels. Some even made the entire trip across the channel with their evacuees. By the end of the operation, more than 338,000 soldiers had been evacuated. Even though the battle had been lost, it was a win for public confidence. The stories of the small boats and civilians jumping to help bring their boys home helped to ignite Britain's fighting spirit and keep the Allied hopes alive. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future videos. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.